So I didn't know this woman, and this has been almost 20 years ago, and some of you have maybe heard me share about her before. I had preached at some event at a church outside of Boston, and this woman had graciously agreed to take me back to the airport. I mean, it had been prearranged, and so we were in her car. I can still remember like being in her small SUV, and I can remember the sun coming in through the window, and I can remember driving along the ocean for a long time, and I can remember her face. And I thanked her, of course, for the ride and for how gracious she was, and she thanked me for being there and preaching, and she said, I'm happy to do this. I'm a realtor, and it gives me this kind of flexibility. And I said, realtor, I love realtors, like all of my life. I mean, my realtors are like my pastors and my guides and my friends, and it's just, being a realtor, it's like a ministry, you know? I mean, it's like helping people get a home, helping people find roots. And she stopped for a minute and she said, yeah, there's a lot of that. And she said, it really wasn't my calling. My calling was teaching. And then she sort of stopped, and I said, well, why did you leave teaching? And she said, well, I'm a single parent, and teaching really worked. I loved it, but it was also good for me to have evenings and weekends and summers free so I could be with my son. But then my son died, and the last thing I wanted was to have my evenings and weekends free. And there was just this kind of pause, and so I said, how old was your son? And she said, 10. And I said, was he sick very long? And she said, it was an accident. We were camping, and he died instantly. She said that was a blessing, and it was a blessing that I was able to be there. And then, you know, there was just a pause, and then I said something, which I say to every parent who's ever lost a child. You know, I'm in awe. I'm in awe. I don't know how you do it. I said, I guess survive is the word. And she said, yes, survive, that's probably the right word. She said, I remember at the start that just thinking, I can't get my feet on the ground in the morning. But Matthew, that was her son, had a collie. And you know, collies have a lot of energy. And she couldn't get rid of that dog. So the dog, she had to get up every morning and take care of the dog. And then she said, and my mother needed me, and I was an only child, and so I had to help my mother. And then she said, and of course I had friends, and I had a pastor, and people who told me I needed to see a therapist and keep going. And she said, and I had a friend. Of course I needed a job, but I couldn't go back to teaching because all the children in my class were Matthew's age, and a friend was a realtor, and so really she made up a job for me. I would meet with her in the morning, and she'd say, take these 10 signs and put them at these addresses, and go to these addresses and pick these signs up, and go to the post office and get these 6 stamped. And she said, I think she was just making up stuff for me, but then one day she really did need me. Her own mother had become ill, and there was a family she was to meet with. She'd met with them a few times, and she said they were really chaotic. She said it wasn't really their fault. They had 3 children, and one of them had been in and out of the hospital like 16, 17 times in the last few years at Boston Children's. And they just had to find a house closer to the hospital or closer to the subway. She said, so I started working with that family, and I remember that just right when it was time to close the deal, their son was back in the hospital, and I had to take the signs, all the stuff for them to sign, to the hospital. And she said, I remember walking in there, and I'd never in my entire life been in a children's hospital. She said, I just still remember going in there and just how overwhelming all the families, and I just thought, I am so thankful that Matthew was so healthy all of his life, never sick, never sick. She said, well, one thing led to another, and I ended up kind of getting involved in helping this family, and I guess the word would be respite care, and then eventually, you know, they were in a more stable position, and then the hospital asked me to help somebody else, and I first said, I don't want to help any family with boys, but, you know, that's what they needed. And she said, and I remember the day, she said, I was involved in so many things, doing picnics for families with sick children and running errands, and there was one day And it was just so overwhelming at the hospital. And I walked out and I sat in the sun and I just cried. I just cried and cried and cried. And then I remember thinking, I am alive, and this is a life, and this is a life worth living. And she said, I don't know if you would say that was a move from surviving to healing, but I remember that moment. You are never going to hear this pastor put those 10 lepers down, because there were a lot more people than that in that leper colony, right? But there were 10 who had the gumption and the spirit and the spunk to just reach out for life, to keep reaching out, to keep saying there has to be a way back into community. I mean, we've all seen it, right? I think of one of my very closest friends, an incredible pastor, incredible pastoral counselor, really remarkable leader. And I remember I was here about to preach an evening service when she called from a psychiatric hospital. Not that unusual, calling on a parishioner, but she had admitted herself to the psychiatric hospital. And I remember thinking, this person is my rock, you know? It had been too much and she needed help. I think of another really dear friend, and about 4 or 5 years ago, it wasn't like the wheels fell off, it's like she took the wheels off. I mean, she had a really good, rich career, really important nonprofit work, and she had become stale and lifeless. And she made a decision to just put it away. And then that was part of a decision that we kind of knew coming, a decision to move on from a marriage. I mean, we've all seen it, right? Someone who looks honestly at the addiction, somebody else who looks honestly at the patterns they're in that are not working. So this morning, these 10 brave souls come and from the deepest part of themselves reach out to rejoin the community. Hallelujah, right? And then there's one more who, on the way, turns back and begins to praise. And Jesus says, yeah, look at this guy. Look at this one who is the foreigner after all, and sets it up. Now, we could use this second part of the story to kind of speak against the first 10, but I think the more helpful way is to say, what is in that story for me? The first story is about healing, and the second story is about wholeness, right? It's about moving to this place of gratitude and joy and thankfulness. Some people win the genetic lottery. We've all known one or two who they just hit the ground in the morning, the sun is shining. A few, right? Most people, it takes intentionality and work. And what's interesting about this passage, there's some clues in there. I think again about this very close friend who's gone through a lot, and she's, I'd say, beat herself up a good bit lately because she's got a lot in front of her that is so rich and promising, and she has these days when she is so overcome with resentment and anger about something somebody did to her, and you know what? She's right. I mean, she got taken to the cleaners. It happens every day, right? It happens every day. Somebody gets something they really don't have coming. Someone takes something that was really yours. Like, look around the world, right? Look at Ukraine, look, it's all over. Look at the Jews. Did they get back what they had taken? No. And it's really eating at her because she knows that right out there, so much delicious, great stuff ahead, and she's just, some days, seething. And I tell her, you gotta cut yourself some slack. It's not always gonna be that intense. There's also some clues here. Right before this story, Jesus is just kind of been laying out all this stuff, you know, small stuff like, just follow me. Oh, and give away everything you have. And forgive everybody you know, and just keep forgiving them, and just, you know, easy stuff like that, right? So the disciples say to Jesus, increase our faith. And what does Jesus say? You know, because you got enough faith. You know, a mustard seed, you have just a mustard seed, that's enough. You all, guess what? Turns out you've got enough faith, right? Turns out, really, all of this stuff, right there in front, right there inside of you, planted in you, enough. And then there's that word turning, that delicious word, turning, kind of turning back, returning, going inward. And then there's the foreigner word. I mean, when I hear this, when I think of the Samaritan, the top part of me goes to, who can I really just dislike? Like, is that governor of Florida, and why is he still there? And what? But I think the word here is more, Jesus says foreigner. He doesn't say enemy, he says foreigner. When I think of foreigner, to be honest, I think of somebody who's got all the challenges I've got, plus the fact that society's like, yeah, you don't really belong, you're an outsider. One of the great gifts about living in society is that all of us live in some place where we get to support the public schools, where we pay taxes, and some of those taxes, even if we're not an educator, right now are helping our children learn. And I'm in Kansas City Public Schools, and so we get these little pieces a few times a year, sometimes touting things like they got accreditation back, which is kind of a big thing. And I confess that I don't always look at these, but I kind of set them aside, and I think I should read that and see how I can be involved. You know, now I'm a little tutor at Lead to Read at Gordon Parks. But then, you know, a few weeks ago I was looking at this one. Here's the class of 2022. They feature 7 people, and they start off asking the high school graduates about their life and their childhood and what their dreams are and what they're doing next. And you know, their childhood, I gotta be honest, of the 7, you know, pretty rough. This young woman, she was born in a refugee camp in Tanzania. She goes on to talk about that and how she came here and how her goal, she has a full ride now to William Jewell, is to work in optometry because her grandmother never could have eyesight. She's also wanting to work and figure out how to make healthcare more affordable because she said her mother was in the hospital for 2 days when she gave birth, and the hospital bill was more than her mother makes in a year. But if you read her story, what comes out, praise and thanksgiving. Oh my gosh, she just goes on and on and on and on and on about the teachers and the opportunities and the gifts. You could see her beaming. And then last year, the guy in the front, well, he was born in Darfur, and he talks about the Darfur genocide, and he got a full ride, came here in 2017, full academic ride. He talks about how it was tough in the refugee camp, then he got sent to another camp, and so he had to start all over in 5th grade and 1st grade because he didn't speak any of the languages, but he got a full ride to Wash University, and then he's gonna go do law school, and then he works on criminal justice. So what is Jesus saying to us when he says foreigner? He is saying, oh my gosh, we have all got broken stuff in front of us and around us, and there are people, believe it or not, who have all of that and also have this from this country, right? Don't come here, we don't want you. Really? I'm like, open the frickin' doors, right? So there's that word. But then back to that word turn. That word turn. It's when you're stuck, and when you're like, are you kidding me? That S-O-B, that person took what? Turn, go back inwards. Last night, some of us saw the dance, What Came with Spring, that our own Jennifer Owen has been putting together. Some of us saw it Friday night also. If you followed it at all, you know it's 5 dancers and a couple of singers and telling the story of what it means to be black for the last 400 years in this country, and it is remarkable. One more performance today at 2 at City Stage Theater. I went back again because it was so incredible, and because of course one of the dancers, who he and his husband have just moved from Denver to Harlow, has been living with us for the last 8 weeks, so I just had to see it again. But it is passion and power and beauty and vulnerability and remarkable. I mean, it is just these human bodies, so beautiful, and pouring out the tragedy and the suffering and the grace and the resilience. And after the performance, which is just 50 minutes, they had this question and answer time, which was again like, this should all be recorded for everyone to hear. And they talked about, like, how do they do this? Like, how do they bring so much out, so much vulnerability out? And they said, we affirm one another. And I noticed that about Chris. He's just constantly posting affirmations, and every morning he's so full of affirmation. And they said, we actually have now written affirmations, and they're all over backstage. I am beautiful, I am worthy, I am invincible, I am incredible. Like just surrounding themselves with all these affirmations so they can move from healing towards wholeness. So what is the stage design we're going to have for our lives, right? What are you going to put around there? What are you going to turn to and return to and keep going back into so that you can keep bringing out the best, the most beautiful, the most radiant piece of who you are? Jesus invites us all to do that, to turn, to praise, to share. May we hear that call this day. Amen.